Good afternoon, good evening, and indeed good morning to colleagues who are joining us from Australia. It's our pleasure to welcome you to the penultimate workshop in our series called the Research Colloquium on Refugee Sponsorship. This is our 7th workshop in the series, and we're delighted to be joined today by an expert panel who are going to discuss the relationship between refugee sponsorship and public attitudes towards refugees. We're excited to be joined by participants from around the globe this morning. The Refugee Hub is pleased to be coordinating this series together with our partners, the Center for Refugee Studies at York University, the Institute for Research into Superdiversity at the University of Birmingham, and the University of Toronto. I'd like to also thank the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue at the University of Ottawa, as well as the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for supporting this colloquium series, and also to thank our team here at the Refugee Hub, whose hard work has made the series possible, especially Eliza Bateman and Jessica Phipps. Since the University of Ottawa sits on unceded Algonquin land, it's our practice to begin our events by reading the university's Indigenous affirmation. And I just want to mention that, of course, we have other participants who are joining from other Indigenous lands around the globe as well. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. To begin our discussion today, I'm very pleased to introduce Jennifer Bond, who will be moderating today's discussion. Jennifer is the founder and managing director of the Refugee Hub at the University of Ottawa, the chair of the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative, and associate professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa. Jennifer, over to you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so much, Nathan. And I just want to echo my thanks very much to colleagues who have put together today's session. Thanks so much to all of you who are joining us, and thanks in particular to our panelists. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. So I have the privilege of kicking us off with just a few short housekeeping notes. For those of you who have not used the Zoom Q&A function before, I'm going to invite you to take a look at the bottom of your screen. If you move your cursor, you get the familiar toolbar at the bottom, and you'll see a Q&A there. If you click on that function, you'll be able to both add questions you'd like to see answered and also vote for questions that others have posted that you're particularly keen to hear our panelists discuss. So please feel free to use the Q&A session as we go through. We'll reserve a period at the end of the segment to pick up some of those questions, but we encourage you to post as we go along. The chat function is also fully live, so while you can't see all of your colleagues who are joining us from around the world, you are able to introduce yourselves and reach out to some of them via the chat function. So feel free to use that as well throughout the segment to make sure that we benefit from all of your expertise. We know we've got a lot of folks joining who bring a lot of background with these subjects, so feel free to use the chat function to share and make comments as well as ask questions. Last housekeeping note is just to note that this is a public event and it is being recorded. We have had quite a lot of interest in this presentation, so just for awareness, we do anticipate sharing the recording with a number of individuals and organizations who aren't with us live today. So do note that the recording will be circulated after the session. So I think that's it for me in terms of housekeeping. Moving on to some brief introductions. I'm thrilled that we're joined today by 4 absolutely fabulous experts and leaders in the field of refugee sponsorship and or communications and outreach in the space. So it's really exciting for me to introduce such tremendous leaders, all folks who I've learned a huge amount from over the years. I'm going to begin with our 3 discussants, starting with Louisa Taylor. Welcome to you, Louisa. Thank you so much for being with us. Louisa is the director of Refugee 613. She brings to her role a tremendous background, both in communications, serving as an award-winning journalist for many, many years, as well as in all kinds of work around newcomer integration and newcomer welcome. Louisa, I've learned so much from you over the years of our partnership around sponsorship, around communications, around being very deliberate and thoughtful about this space. And I'm just thrilled that you're here to share your expertise today. So thank you so much for being with us. I'm also very delighted to welcome very early in the morning, Dr. Graham Tom. Thank you for being with us, Graham. Likewise, has been my privilege to learn from you over years. I think a real leader in the space of refugee resettlement and protection. Graham leads Amnesty International Australia's work on refugees and has done that for many years. I hope that we'll hear more through your presentation today, Graham, about the My New Neighbor campaign and the tremendous leadership Amnesty has shown around refugee sponsorship. But just to note here, I think it has been one of the most impressive campaigns we've seen around sponsorship in the world, and really has mobilized tools thinking about not only sponsorship as a protection pathway, but also as a tool for public engagement and changing public attitudes. So to congratulate you on that tremendous work, and really delighted you're here to share more about it. I'm also really thrilled to welcome your colleague, Ali Al-Batat. Thank you so much for being here, Ali. I'm thrilled to have you. Ali is an Iraqi-Australian emerging social worker who is incredibly active in his community. It was a privilege for me, Ali, to read about all of the tremendous leadership roles that you've taken in your community. And I'm so thrilled that that includes being an advisor to the My New Neighbor campaign. So really excited to hear more from you about your role and your contributions to that campaign. And as I say, congratulations to you and your colleagues on such a successful effort. Some big announcements from Australia just before the holiday break that I'm looking forward to hearing more about as part of today's conversation.
Thank you, Jennifer.
That rounds out our discussants. I'm thrilled now to introduce our keynote speaker, Tim Dixon, who is a person who brings a tremendous number of backgrounds and skills to his current role as co-founder of More in Common. Those backgrounds include work in law, in politics, in communications, and I think really Tim serving as a leading social entrepreneur, really trying to solve some of the world's biggest problems. He has been a close friend and teacher of the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative since before it began, and I think really has taught everybody working in the sponsorship field a tremendous amount about the potential of this as a tool to shape public attitudes. So we're really thrilled that you're here to kick off the conversation, Tim, and I'll begin by turning it over to you. Warmest welcomes, and thanks again for being here.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and great to join Ali and Louisa and Graham for this conversation. I thought it might be useful for me to say a few things just about my own journey, because I've kind of wrestled with the question of why is there such strong public opposition, and why is it such a challenge to shift public attitudes on the question of refugees? And my history with this kind of goes back really to growing up with a lot of migrant kids who were from families who'd come as refugees to Australia in the post-Second World War era, Italians and Hungarians and people from all across Europe. And then the kids who'd come as refugees in the 1970s in the big Indo-Chinese refugee influx, which also was seen in Canada and the United States. And what's interesting about that is, at that point in the 1980s, Australia and Canada were very similar countries in terms of the narrative they had about multiculturalism and about welcoming refugees. But 20 years later, things really diverged in Australia in 2001. And there was this sort of moment that just shocked me, because I think I'd just grown up with the expectation that, you know, and a sense of pride about growing up in the country with a history of welcoming refugees, and a sense that that was normal, and a sense that we were sort of moving beyond the kind of race baiting, the unpleasantness of kind of a racism in our history, you know, imperfectly, but moving on from it. And you suddenly had this return of a very aggressive language that demonized people who were fleeing war and persecution, with what was known as the Tampa incident. And without going into the detail, it was just a moment when suddenly the country focused on that issue and really bought into a way of seeing refugees that was just so far from the truth, but ultimately kind of became locked into policy making. It was a big motivation for me, actually, at the time, to decide from my comfortable perch in a big law firm. Oddly, now I have to explain to you that Australia is a big country. Not everybody knows each other, but it does happen to be true that the law firm partner that I worked with was Graham's own relationship, family partner. So Graham and I also have a little bit of history that goes back to that era. But I felt from you know, being in a different role in life, I got to do something about this. And so I decided to get into politics and see how I could make a difference. And I was able to do that. And then, you know, not too many years later, from within a Prime Minister's office, where I was a chief speechwriter, I was economic advisor, I wasn't a specialist in migration, but I learnt and saw from within a government that was actually trying to liberalise, to be more welcoming of refugees, to shift from some of the policy settings. I learned how hard that was, and I saw how the sort of a backlash came about quite quickly, and how ineffective the efforts to shift public attitudes from within government were. So that was a significant moment for me. Now, fast forward, I leave Australia a few years later in 2011, and I've done a lot of work building organisations around campaigns and a wide range of issues. And I was involved with the supporting the moderate civil society in Syria, not so much from the refugee perspective initially, but more from the perspective of protecting civilians from the bombings and so forth. And at that moment, I saw, wow, 2015, around that time, that there was this inflection point where the lives of hundreds of thousands of people were going to be affected by where public attitudes went. I could see what was happening, the rise of the far right, the authoritarian populists who were demonizing refugees. And that was then a motivation for me, because by that time I really knew how to build organizations, how to fundraise, how to run large scale campaigns. And so that was what I then aimed to do at that point, was let's get really step up our campaigning and communications to prevent what had happened in Australia happening all across Europe. Now, in doing that, one thing that I was really committed to was getting good evidence, doing really good research and finding out the roots of why there is opposition, why people are able to play up the anxieties of the public and turn them against, make them fearful of people who really actually just need our protection and refuge. And that was the beginning of what's now More in Common, the organisation that I co-founded in 2016. And where sponsorship fits in, and why I'm here today, is that in a very hostile environment, in a very tough environment, and one which is going to continue to be difficult for years to come, the greatest opportunity I identified based on all of our research to shift attitudes and therefore to change people's lives was around community sponsorship. And what I want to unpack today is just really why. So I'm going to share some insights from our research, some findings, just to give you some statistics and some things that are very solid. And then I want to explain, based on sort of condensing a lot of insight work that we've done over the last few years, why the storytelling around community sponsorship can really shift attitudes and leave you with some sort of practical suggestions, or at least directions, in how to talk about and engage sponsorship. So we'll get our slides up now. And what I've done here, and this is for the sake of if you follow up and want to have a more detailed look at the slide deck, in the next slide you'll see some of More in Common's publications. So we publish a lot of research. You've seen that you've got in the chat function a link to our website. But if you just go to the next slide, a key part of our work, of sort of our lens on the world, is diving deep into behavioral science and the way in which people think. And what we've learned is that people's orientation to society and where they see themselves within society fundamentally shapes the way they see all sorts of issues, from issues around refugees and migration, to climate, to democracy, to a range of different, what would seem to be unrelated issues. And this is the kind of thing that we do a mapping of different people, different groups. I won't go into the detail of it, but just to give you a sense of, we do a lot of work around segmenting the public into sort of cameos, or sort of groups that describe the main elements of their orientation to the world. And what we've found is that when you do that without asking any questions about immigration, it's very highly predictive of the way people think about issues of migration and refugees. So that's sort of what sits behind the findings that I'm going to share. If we move to the next slide. This is just a kind of a primer on explaining why we use behavioral science in our work. And I'm really just kind of letting you see a little bit under the hood here of the sorts of research partners we've worked with to better understand the us versus them dynamics that sociology and social psychology speaks about. The heart of it is that the misperceptions people have around refugees is that they perceive refugees as being other to themselves, as being different. And for some people, particularly those who feel most insecure, people who are other are more easily seen as a threat to them, or as hostile to them. And the fundamental insight from our work is that there's limits to how effective you can be in making fact-based arguments if people see a refugee or see refugees as other. And therefore, the key thing that you have to do in communications is to more tell a bigger story of us, where people see commonality. And that then breaks down the ways in which people easily fall into us versus them narratives. If we go to the next slide. What I want to do now is just very quickly take you through some findings. We've done quite a bit of research over the last 5 years that specifically looks at people's perceptions of sponsorship. Now, the public doesn't know much outside of Canada, doesn't really know much about sponsorship. So there's detailed wording there about the way in which we've asked the questions. We've contextualized that in each country where we've done the research, but it's in a sentence or two providing people with a snapshot of what sponsorship's about. And what you see is that when you ask a question about support or opposition for welcoming refugees, in the case here, this is a question around the US RAP program, accepting refugees fleeing war or persecution from other countries. Do you support or oppose this policy? There's a 10% support gap, that is 49 to 39 people support policy, but when you frame it through the lens of refugee sponsorship, the 10-point gap doubles to 22 points. If we go to the next slide, this is something more specific where we've been asking questions just recently. There's a study we released in November around the resettlement of Afghan allies, focusing on the attitudes of military veterans. And that showed 63% support among veterans for the resettlement of Afghan allies. But what's especially interesting, if we go to the next slide, is we asked the question, to what extent would an opportunity to help resettle Afghan allies improve your well-being and mental health? Now, that's the right way to frame for this particular policy issue rather than talk all about sponsorship. But what's fascinating here is that you get 4 out of 5 Afghanistan veterans. I mean, typically not actually a community you would think of as being pro-refugee, but 4 out of 5 saying it would benefit them themselves, their well-being, their mental health, to be involved in effectively community sponsorship. And that compares to 3 out of 5 in the general population. And it's not an angle that often refugee advocates think of using, that it's good for you. because typically, we're people who are motivated by altruism, so we want to make the argument around principle. But I do think there's a real argument here about the sponsors benefit as much as, well, not as much as, but the sponsors benefit, very significantly. And if you're a veteran from Afghanistan, there's a particular emotional connection there. So it's an interesting finding. Anyway, there's a sort of a larger report that sits behind that. It's not just the United States, though. If we go to the next slide. In Germany, we actually found a very similar finding to the US. That is a 12-point difference, a 12-point positive shift if you frame welcoming refugees through the lens of sponsorship. Now, in this case, you've got overall, there's more opposition than support, because Germany, as we know, has taken in such a huge number in 2016. But the 54 to 36 opposition goes to 45-39. And if we look at in the UK, where we've got, just forward one. If we look at the UK, where we've got overall support, 54 to 33, that 21-point gap increases to 24. Now, why is there a smaller increase in the UK? I think the answer is because there's a point where the greatest difference sponsorship has is in countries where there's more opposition, or the support isn't quite as high. And it might also be that, particularly around Afghanistan, there was all the concern about Afghanistan already sort of increases people's support above the normal level for accepting refugees in the UK. But anyway, you see a positive shift. What's more significant and interesting in the UK context is to look at the subgroups of the population where there's a shift in attitudes. So in the next slide, there's a particular segment that we call in our work in the UK, in a report we called Britain's Choice, that digs into the sort of the mapping of the values identity of Brits. And the Loyal Nationals are a group that are very patriotic. They have shifted very significantly in their votes in recent years from Labor to Conservatives. They are the group most at risk of buying into us versus them narratives, that is, and anti-immigration narratives. And what's fascinating here is that you get a 27-point positive shift in their attitudes towards welcoming refugees when you frame it through the lens of sponsorship. So within that, a really critical segment, probably the politically most important segment actually in the UK, there is a very large shift. If we go to the next slide, there's another segment which is more a sort of a core support base for Conservatives called Backbone Conservatives. And there again, you get a 20-point shift from a margin of opposition, 28 points, down to opposition of just 8 points. So, I mean, that's just very quickly taking you through some examples of where there's a shift when you talk about sponsorship. I don't want to sort of, I won't go further into the research findings, but it's just to say the shifts are very significant, and they're very significant in the populations that matter the most. So go to the next slide. Another question and another dimension of this is people in communities want to take part as well in sponsorship. Now, we asked this question in the UK, what actions would you like to take if a refugee is sponsored in your community? 9% of people, so I mean that in a country, 1 in 11 people, but it's millions of people in every country, say that they would like to join a sponsorship group. And there's some interesting breakdowns there about which segments that make sense if you've got a sort of a feel for the segmentation that we've done in the UK. But twice as many people want to donate money. Other people want to contribute by teaching English, fundraising, helping in practical ways. Some people say that they'd like to protest, 7%, or complain on social media. So some people are motivated to go in the other direction, but they're a pretty small minority actually. So there's also a piece here where sponsorship motivates people to take action, and that is significant because action changes people's attitudes as much as arguments do. So if we go to the next slide, the question that I want to ask and what I want to spend the last few minutes on is just why. What does our work tell us about why we consistently see the capacity here for talking about sponsorship to have a positive shift or positive impact on public attitudes? And remembering here that with most of these questions, we're literally just mentioning the concept. So I actually think when people see sponsorship in action, it will be even more powerful than just explaining the concept in a couple of sentences and seeing people's responses. But why is that? So I'm going to give you 10 suggested reasons why. If we go to our next slide. First is that people's anxiety about refugees, there's a lot of people who are broadly supportive of the principle that our country, their country, should be taking in those who are fleeing violence and persecution. But they have anxieties at the same time. Most people, we talk about them being the kind of conflicted middle or anxious middle, where they see positives and see negatives. And a lot of that anxiety is about a fear of disorderly movements of people, the loss of control of borders, the feeling that the country's not able to protect itself from any risks of the wrong sorts of people coming in, people who might present a threat to the country. Sponsorship is orderly and managed, and it therefore counters, it deals with that concern, and in a sense frees people up to be supportive of the more principled position of welcoming refugees. Second, and I mentioned here about the underlying concerns that drive a sort of anti-migration or anti-refugee attitudes, which is around, as I say, loss of control, threats to traditional culture and values, fear of terrorism, crime, economic risks and costs associated with people coming in, and sometimes public health concerns. In Italy, for example, you see that. So I'm going to mention a couple more of these risk factors that are dealt with by sponsorship as well. We'll go to the next slide. The second reason is sponsorship helps people see refugees not as the other, but as people who are like us. It makes it much harder for an us versus them narrative to prevail when you see the kids playing in the local football team, or the mum who's helping feed an elderly neighbour in their community, or whatever it is. But it breaks down. Sponsorship puts refugees among other people in a community visually in terms of the images, and that helps to break down the us versus them. Next slide. Sponsorship elevates the people who are most trusted in communities nowadays, which is ordinary people, not the professional spokespeople, the politicians, the people from NGOs. The people that we trust the most, the people, and especially the segments of the community that we most need to reach, they are most likely to see as authentic someone who's like a nurse or a teacher or a policeman or something like that, somebody who's just more relatable. And sponsorship elevates those relatable messengers. Next slide. Sponsorship also unites people in local communities around a meaningful project. It creates these great stories of collaboration and team spirit and collective effort. And that's especially important because many of the people who are more anxious about refugees coming into their community are also just anxious about the loss of community, the loss of community spirit. And so if they see a strengthening of community action, people coming together, that actually, because that's something that they value more highly than the wider community does, it has a particularly positive influence on them. Next. Sponsorship also changes people. And one insight from behavioral science is that many people, even though traditionally communications campaigns that activists run are about arguments, there's a lot of evidence that people are more shifted by actually doing things, by changing their behavior. We change our behavior and then we change our attitudes. And that's particularly true with some population segments that we've identified in different countries. So if you get people doing stuff like painting a fence, helping out and getting the kids to school, whatever, like practical action, you can actually get people who are kind of quite skeptical about welcoming refugees, but they might, because of a spouse or a friend who's involved in a sponsorship group, they might get involved in a community activity, and that then changes their attitudes. So sometimes behavior leads attitudes rather than attitudes changing behavior. And sponsorship taps into that because it's about real world action. Next. Sponsorship connects to the identities and deepest values of different groups in the community. So for example, churches play a key role in many of the sponsorship stories, a large number of the sponsorship stories in Canada, and that will be the case in all countries with sponsorship programs, but also students, LGBT community. So having those communities where people have a strong sense of affiliation, having that community lead the process of welcoming, forming a sponsorship group and so forth, then connects people to refugees in a way that speaks to their deepest affinities as well. Next. Sponsorship also helps to integrate newcomers into communities because it breaks down that sense of refugees as the other. And one of the deepest concerns of groups that are more anxious about welcoming refugees is the feeling that, well, they don't fit in, they're not like us. But you can't say that when you see exactly the opposite happening. And so many of the images, powerful images that come out from Canada's program, and Louisa and Refugee 613 and many other organizations do a great job telling these stories. So many of those images are about that kind of that mixing, that integration. So that's a very powerful rebuttal to the deepest concerns that sometimes people might not even articulate, but it's what sort of sits behind their anxieties about welcoming refugees. Then more specifically, next slide, sponsorship addresses specific concerns about acquisition of language, acquisition of values and the traditions of a country, because there's a community that comes around a family or an individual who's sponsored, and that helps to them to fit in and become part of their community. So it's powerful in that way, in that it, again, sort of addresses concerns that people have. And then the 9th point, sponsorship involves ordinary people helping to foot the bill for resettling refugees. And it's not a concern that everybody shares, even among people who are anxious about welcoming refugees, but it's a concern that some people share, and sometimes they have wildly inaccurate understandings of how much support refugees actually get. But as soon as they see that there's a community group that's taking leadership, even though, as we know, like the actual policies are a kind of co-sponsorship model where there is still government support, it goes a long way in addressing that concern. They kind of, I mean, we've seen it in focus groups, they literally go like, oh, well, that's okay then. It's not, they're not like a burden. The refugees are not a burden on us. So again, it sort of addresses a deep concern. And finally, sponsorship generates powerful personal stories from everyday life, the stories that actually speak to bigger causes of concern and anxiety about the state of the world today. People's sense of being disconnected, and they see stories of connection. They're stories that are powerful as well, that they're not just the things that you see in a video, but the thing that strikes me talking to Canadians, and not just people who work on these issues, is just how many people in Canada, after 400,000, it was 400,000, 300,000, I can't remember that, but after 40 years of the sponsorship program, so many people have had personal experience and can recount that personal experience, and those stories get told over and over again. Not that they're all perfect, of course, but they're just powerful because they're so much more personalized. So that's just a quick tour through why we understand that you see this shift in attitudes around sponsorship. I think the next slide is just to tell you where to find me on Twitter. But that's just to sort of kick off the conversation, and looking forward to hearing from my colleagues.
Great, thanks so much, Tim. And I have to tell you that as you were speaking, my text was starting to ping with people saying how brilliant you were and how much they look forward to staying in touch and learning more from you. So thank you so much for inspiring everybody here. For those of you who do have questions for Tim, comments, thoughts to share, I'll encourage you, feel free to start popping those into the Q&A section or the chat section. We're really excited to bring your voice voices, thoughts, and perspectives, not only into our chats. I agree, Tim is wonderful, but also into the shared space. So feel free to populate there. Thank you so much to you, Tim, for kicking us off. I remember vividly the very early conversation we had where you introduced to me for the first time the idea of this trusted messenger, and having really grown up surrounded by sponsorship in Canada, had never really reflected on what it meant to have so many friends, neighbors, different types of colleagues and coworkers all speaking about their sponsorship experiences, so much so that it just becomes part of the fabric of how you understand your society, and really benefited from you helping me see that trusted messenger role as one of the key things that sponsors do. So thank you for reminding us of that and so much else. Again, I welcome folks to begin using Q&A and chat function if you've got thoughts or questions for Tim. We're going to layer in a few more perspectives before we open up for that conversation. And I'm really delighted to now turn it over to Graham. Now we know you've been a long-standing connection there in Australia. Graham, thank you so much for being with us. I know we're catching you at an uncomfortable time in the time zone. Really thrilled you're here, and over to you to speak a bit more about your work on this topic.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jennifer. And thanks, Tim, for a great introduction. I think you've hit a lot of the points that, have really driven Amnesty's campaigning in this particular field, because really it's that us versus them dynamic that, we've seen in Australia in the last 20 years, and particularly issues around boats, boat turnbacks, stop the boat selections, offshore processing, mandatory detention, all these things have been so polarizing in Australia and so toxic. And yet Australia has always had a proud tradition in resettlement, but not in community sponsorship. And so for those of us who've been working in this space and thinking, how do we get people who are passionate about refugees and refugee protection, who are so burnt out by the negative rhetoric in Australia and just the toxic debate that we've seen here, to be able to reframe that in a positive way, that you can actually do something positive to help refugees, and something that's going to have a long-term impact around shaping attitudes to refugees in this country. So community sponsorship is actually something that Amnesty, with the Refugee Council here and others, have been working on since 2010. We sort of felt that this was something that Australia could do to help contribute to the greater issues around the world that need sponsorship, that need resettlement as a solution. We got a pilot program in 2013, which really was just a fast-track family reunion program. It still excluded most Australians. In fact, it became even more exclusionary for other Australians to be able to be part of sponsorship. So we continued to campaign, and then in 2017, they turned that into the CSP, an actual program. But once again, it was a glorified family reunion program that was extremely expensive, like 3 times the cost of the Canadian program, and also had all sorts of other restrictions. And so it was not completely ignored, but the Refugee Council in Australia often jokes that of all the resettlement programs of any country anywhere in the world, this is the only one that was undersubscribed. It was extraordinary. And both those pilots and programs took places out of Australia's humanitarian program. So for someone like me, if I wanted to sponsor someone, I would either be taking a place from UNHCR and their capacity to refer, or I would be taking the place from an Australian who was trying to sponsor a family member. So what possible benefit would there be for me to actually sponsor someone? It was actually going to be a negative experience for someone. So that's where Amnesty started its My New Neighbour campaign. We felt, for all the reasons that Tim has outlined, that we needed to get a broader base of Australia engaged. And we needed to make sure that it included the refugee voice. And it's great to have Ali here, and I'm not going to steal any of his thunder. But one of the things that Amnesty did do was made sure that we had a refugee advisory group. We wanted to have people with lived experience actually being able to tell their stories. As Tim outlined, we wanted their neighbours, your neighbours, to be able to talk to you and say, this is why sponsorship has helped me, and this has been my experience in the community in Australia through sponsorship. So that became a really important voice in terms of what we were doing. We then reached out our campaign to not the usual suspects. We got out of Melbourne and Sydney, and we went to regional and rural Australia, once again, because we knew that those are places where if you're a refugee who's resettled in those areas, and we're going to hear about Shepparton, the chances are you would have met a broad base of Australian society. And so therefore the impact of arrivals in those areas are far more obvious and far more appreciated. And so we then targeted local councils. We had something like 30 local councils sign up to our My New Neighbour campaign. We had sporting groups, we had church groups. We made sure we got stories in local media. We didn't just target mainstream media. We wanted to make sure that this was a voice that was getting out far and wide, while at the same time we were able to go back to the government and say, look, your current program is simply not working, and these are the reasons it's not working. Why don't you come up with a program that will enable all Australians to be involved? And what was actually really positive was that the Australian government listened at a time when we still had a lot of very negative attitudes in this country, and including through COVID, where Australia shut its borders in a way that most other countries didn't shut their borders. And there was a lot of public support for shutting that borders, keeping people out. But we were still able to talk to the government about community sponsorship. And so they did put in a review. And this review has taken some time, but because we'd done the groundwork, we were able to get all those local councils, all those local groups, other individuals who've seen our work, to be able to write in to this government review. It was held, I'll get this right, the Commonwealth Coordinator General for Migration Services conducted the review. And so we were able to get a groundswell of information to her, demonstrating support throughout Australia. And as one of the things the government was very keen to see was refugees getting out into regional and rural Australia and supporting industries out in the community. So those two things dovetailed really nicely. When the report came out, it was even stronger than we imagined, and it highlighted that there was broad public support for an unlinked community sponsorship. So not just sponsorship of family, but like the UK, like Ireland, like New Zealand, who all set up community sponsorship programs recently, it was going to be communities who just said, look, I want to sponsor a refugee. You know, I don't know a refugee, but I really want to help. And therefore UNHCR had that capacity, working with those governments, to be able to say, well, here is somebody in desperate need. Will the sponsors take this person? And so, you know, it is contributing to the protection mandate of UNHCR and what resettlement is about, while at the same time providing that community connection and the ability for all Australians to be able to say, I want to contribute more broadly to a global problem. And I can do that. What we got, I know our time is short, so I'll cut it short. But what we did get at the end of last year was the government responding to that review. Finally, it took them a few months. And again, in the middle of that, we had the Afghan crisis where Australia had to scramble to rescue 4,000 people out of Afghanistan, again, in the middle of COVID. So a lot of things were working against us. But as Tim has highlighted, the Afghan crisis and the ability to rescue people was positively received in Australia. Something like 48% of people, when they polled, said, yes, we should increase resettlement and we should be doing more for the Afghans. And only 24% said no. So it was a big difference. And I think that helped the government say, yes, we're going to change the program. So not only did they take the old program and make it a lot cheaper, so family could actually afford to do it without having to go in debt, they also introduced a new program, an unlinked program, where church groups, all the groups that Tim has mentioned, can now come together and say, we would like to sponsor a refugee. The sad news is at the moment, it's not in addition to the program, it's still going to come out of the program. So that's something for us to work on, but that's what happened in the UK as well too. And when it worked, the UK shifted it to be additional. So that's what we're hoping for. It's going to be even cheaper than the Canadian program. The refugees who come are going to be entitled to welfare support in a way that they're not in Canada. So from that perspective, it's even more positive. And yeah, the ability to have another group that's been set up to provide support for sponsors is also going to be there. So that's happened in the UK as well, which is going to be really important to make sure that groups are aware of their responsibilities, that they don't overreach, that they do provide the kind of support for vulnerable people that's going to be needed. So a lot of really positive things. It's going to be 1,500 people over the next few years, starting small, but let's see where it goes. You know, for Australia, this is a really positive step. So I'll end it there. It's a way that campaigning has actually led to a positive outcome. And so we're very excited here at the moment.
Thanks, Graham. And so many reasons to be excited. Congratulations again for Amnesty's leadership. As you said, back to 2010, that you took ownership over the issue of sponsorship and really tried to mobilize. And I do think it's exciting for experts from across the world who are joining us today to note that there are going to be these two dimensions to the Australian program. As Graham mentioned, a decreasing in cost for linked cases means that will become a reanimated form of community sponsorship, and in parallel, a launch of a new program with some different policy settings focusing on UNHCR referred refugees. So a rich and rejuvenated program there. And Graham, one of the things that struck me as you were talking was really your emphasis on removing barriers to sponsorship to allow people to take up this opportunity. And I think that's really consistent, Tim, with your framing that people benefit from this. And it's partly about repositioning our understanding of how these relationships can work and who benefits and who's being empowered. So thank you so much, Graham. I know you're not able to stay with us until the close of the session. So in case you have to dash away before we come back, just to thank you again for being here and for all of your leadership on this and so many other issues. I think that what we might do is go now to Canada, bring things back a little closer to home for me sitting here in Ottawa by turning to Louisa. And then Ali, maybe we can give you some final reflections on some of the leadership roles that you've been taking to support and really develop the strategies that led to this big win in Australia. So why don't we come up next to Louisa for your reflections. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you. Wow, that's amazing work, Graham. I'm so excited for all of you, and just knowing all the work that's gone into getting to this point. You know, it'd be great to think that it's going to be smooth sailing, but I'm sure you know better than anybody. It's going to be a lot of peaks and valleys, really, right, over time. And in listening to Tim and then listening to you, I feel like here in Canada, you know, we may have that kind of that work behind us in the sense that we've had this program now for so many years, and the sponsor the stranger or the unlinked sponsorship is much younger, of course, but we have this environment of sponsorship that people in this history that people are so aware of here in Canada, but framing it in terms of sponsorship's impact on public opinion and public support for refugees, I think has not happened as much here in sense of being an intentional tool for working on that support. And that's what we're working on here. And I think that there's a feedback loop, right, between these things. And so I think what really hit me listening to you, Tim, was applying the social psychology and applying the tools that More in Common uses all the time to this question is something that we generally need to do more of. And we're only starting to do that here in Canada. Because I think, you know, what you're looking at is when people are, what is the impact when people do sponsor, you know, how does that help us with public opinion? What we've been looking at at Refugee 613 is how do you get people to sponsor? How do you get them to that experience, knowing all of the things that we know? And so what you've done is you've brought an evidence base to what in the sector we can sort of say anecdotally, and also elevated it really in terms of the analysis. And I think for us, that idea that, so we've had this project RESPO initially funded by the Shapiro Foundation, and now with the federal government, our Department of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. Our focus is on looking at recruitment and retention of sponsors. And so it really grew out of the sense in civil society that, you know, initially our sponsorship program was seen as a cost-saving measure by the federal government, but it has very clearly become for civil society a community building tool. And as a community building tool, part and parcel of that is how it changes people, as you said, Tim, the act of sponsoring, the behavioral change leading the attitude change we see is so evident. Any of us who've done it, we feel it, broadens your horizons. It broadens your horizons not only about worlds abroad, but about worlds at home, and you better understand what it's like. A lot of people who sponsor have not had to look for an apartment on a low income in a long time here in Ottawa, I can say, or they get a different window on, for instance, our housing, our affordable housing crisis. So it's that humanitarian tool and that community building tool, and very much tied into that public opinion piece. So what we've been doing at RESPO is really making the case that sponsorship is not going to sell itself, unfortunately, as much as we wish it would. And as much as those of us who are working in progressive spaces think that it's self-evident that this is a good and should be undertaken, it's not. And we will not have a robust program that lives on for decades if we don't broaden the base of who is sponsoring. And what that often means is taking them from awareness that sponsorship exists, which is your first battle, especially if it's a new program, but putting them on that continuum to taking action and becoming a sponsor themselves. So we're really thrilled to say we've had tremendous support from the federal government, IRCC, and we're now convening a working group with them and with other members of civil society who are very active in refugee sponsorship. Some of you will know of the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program, which, you know, is really the nucleus, the hub for a lot of great sponsorship information and training. They are also the folks who do the matching for our BVOR program. Together, we're literally working on key messaging. We're working on recruitment tactics to broaden that support. And we're all doing this with the realization that this is not a quick, cause and effect. Sponsorship, the kinds of sponsorship we're taking about takes, yes, the year of sponsorship, but the months leading up to getting someone to sponsor, right, and to engage and to sign on. So it's a slow moving process, but it builds going back again to what Tim was saying, the action changing the attitude. I don't know if you used the word this time, Tim, but when you were in Ottawa, I loved how you framed it with inoculating people against the negative and divisive messaging. And we see that very much so. And so seeing at a strategic policy level, seeing sponsorship as a way to slowly, gradually build out a base of people who can say from personal experience, I know that refugees are not what you are telling me they are. So inoculating them against that misinformation, I think, is a huge component to it. And that idea, I'm just looking at, I was writing notes about your 10 factors, and number 4, that meaningful collective action. We have really seen that sponsorship, it doesn't have to be the what we call the BVOR or community sponsorship model. It can be any sponsorship model, but we find it particularly in the case of the sponsor the stranger. You're building relationships not just with the refugees being sponsored, but within the group itself. And often that will bring institutions together and make them stronger, help them have stronger relationships between people and institutions. The favorite example I love to use is a friend of mine who joined a sponsorship group. She got her neighbors involved, and they connected with a church around the corner that none of them attended and had never had anything to do with, but they became a unit together. And that lives on long past the sponsorship itself. So as part of RESPO, we're doing this convening and we're doing this working group together, and it's a great team effort. We're also piloting some models for collaborative recruitment. So connecting people in a geographic area to do that promotion itself. We're providing communications training because I think one of the biggest mental shifts is understanding that this is a marketing effort in some ways, in many ways. It's a persuasion effort. And once you start to use that terminology, it's not only unfamiliar in this context to a lot of people, but uncomfortable, because it feels like you are selling people, which you're not. But social marketing is about changing behavior, and that's really where we are, changing people from not being sponsors to being sponsors, or changing people from not being supportive of refugees to being supportive. And so it's a tool. It's long and slow, but very effective, I think. And I'll stop there because I really want to hear from Ali.
Great, thank you so much, Louisa. As always, learning from you as you're continuing to share your wisdoms and reflections, and the work that you're leading to try to understand what we know and don't know in Canada, and how to really do more in a more thoughtful and deliberate way, I think is not only teaching Canadians a lot about our program, but also teaching the world. So thanks so much for those reflections. And I think this concept of social marketing is a really exciting one for us to think about, and maybe one we want to talk about a little bit more as we broaden the conversation. So Ali, I'm going to turn it over to you. And I'm really delighted to share with everybody here the fact that this campaign, which both Graham and I have mentioned, really did mobilize tens of thousands of Australians in support of sponsorship, even before you really had a functioning sponsorship program. So I'm hoping you'll be able to reflect a little bit on those efforts and share with us some of your advice and guidance about how we can link the tool of sponsorship, both in its idea and as it's a reality, to public attitude. So looking forward to learning from you, and thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'd like to start with just a short quote, which I really like, and I'd like to start with that, which is, no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. When it comes to community sponsorship, it's something that really hits home for myself. I'm a former refugee myself. But unfortunately, I didn't have the privilege of coming on such a community sponsorship program. My family and I had to take the risky way of taking the boat to Australia in the early 2000s. I came here as a 1.5-year-old child to Australia and been living here for the past 22 years. Community sponsorship first came up in my life back in 2019 when it first came up, and it's something that I started to portray more and more interest as I dug deeper into it. My fellow colleague Shankar Kasanathan, that many of you may know, is someone that really inspires me and really got me involved in this sector. One thing that Shankar and other colleagues, running the My New Neighbor campaign, figured out was a very powerful tool to use was the voice of former refugees as advisors for the My New Neighbor campaign. When it comes to such issues, I feel like it's very, very, very crucial that we use the voices of those who experience this journey. Sometimes, we could go out there and speak on behalf of people, but it's very important and very powerful that we share their voices or they share their own voices. Hearing those stories of refugees, the journey they went through, and how it could be much different, much safer. We've seen it in the past 10 years of the amount of Syrians, for example, that have left their country in the most dangerous ways. We've seen that powerful image of that young baby that passed away on the shore, and how powerful and viral that photo went on social media and everywhere in the world. It really tells us that those people are not risking their lives for no reason. Those people are leaving homes. Those people are leaving families. Those people are letting go of everything in order to just get a safe home. That's all they're asking for. One thing that really stands out for me in terms of the changes that have been happening in our community sponsorship program in Australia, when I look back to it just before those recent changes happened, and all I could see is privilege yelling out. It's not fair, it's not just. That's the reality of it. The criteria is, when it comes to cost, very high cost. When it comes to requirements, very, very strict requirements on language, education, jobs, everything that they're putting, just for me as a former refugee, screams out privilege, because people have had to let go of their education for the past 10 years in war-torn countries because their schools are getting burnt down, their teachers are getting executed. It's very horrific. Or circumstances like Afghanistan, where females are not even able to go to access education. Creating a program that has so much restrictions and that involves a lot of privilege was something very frustrating for myself and other colleagues. But we're really happy that, as mentioned earlier, the recent changes have reduced the cost, have minimized some of that strict criteria that just minimizes the opportunity for people that are actually at risk. And I feel like that's something that the whole world should, listen to and take into consideration. One thing that I'd like to throw out there, and for other programs across the globe to take into consideration, is when we're working on such great changes in terms of policy, governance, immigration, it's very important that in that original planning process that we include refugees in it, and not any refugees. I feel like the most powerful thing that we could do is including those that have come to our countries through the community sponsorship program. Hearing their stories directly is much different to us sitting on a table and just thinking, what would suit these people. In reality, we need those people and see what worked for them, what didn't work for them, and how we could make that community sponsorship program as perfect as possible. Perfect is it's probably a bit too much, but I guess as fair and just as possible. It's very important, looking at it from a social work lens, to achieve social justice, we need to firstly incorporate equity, equity as in fairness. If we're not able to achieve equity, we can't really reach equality, which is, and then, at the end, we can't even achieve social justice. Those three factors, one is connected and intertwined to the other. And it's important that we take all those into perspective. An image that always sticks in my mind as a social worker is the image of 5 people watching a football game, and where it shows that you can't really give the same resources to every single person, because it won't work for everyone. Each unique individual need their unique resources. One thing that I see here in Shepparton as a regional town, and what's worked for us in supporting refugees, is the importance of people from similar experiences supporting those that come newly arrived to Australia. We've experienced it, myself and my family. When we first came, we were so welcomed by, for example, the Greeks, the Italians, Macedonians here in Shepparton, because these were people that came to Australia 20 years before we came. And they know exactly what we're experiencing, because you come in a country and you're so lost, you don't speak the language, you don't know how the legal system works, you don't know how to access services. So it's very important to speak to people that went through the exact same journey or similar journey to you, and learn from their mistakes and their progress and how things worked for them. In terms of our community sponsorship program here in Australia, we're continuing to collaborate more with organizations that are both in regional and metro Australia, because it's important that we hear everyone's journeys, everyone's experiences, and what worked in regionals, for example, in Victoria, what worked in regional Victoria and what worked in metropolitan Victoria, because they're two completely different experiences. And I'm aware of time, and I didn't have a look at the time on when I started, so I'll pass it back to you, Jennifer.
Great, thank you so much, Ali, and really want to thank you for not only sharing your expertise and reflections as an advisor and an expert in this space, but also as somebody who has a personal experience, and really we benefit tremendously from you sharing that with us today. So thank you so much. And I want to open it up now to a broader conversation, bring back some of the questions and comments that we're getting through the chat function. We do have about 10 to 15 minutes left. So I'm going to try to batch a few of the comments. I've got the top 3 organized. I'll turn them over to our panelists for some quick reflections. And then I'll be looking back to the chat function and the question and answers for other questions. So I just wanted to put to you, and I think Ali, really building on your comments here about the importance of bringing in folks with lived experiences. We have a question about how we need to change our outreach strategy, how we need to ensure that our communications tools, or Louisa, to borrow your language, the social marketing tools reach different types of populations. And I think, Tim, this speaks to your sense as well, that we need to find these broad points of consensus in our population, and some of your segments pointing to where we can have impact. So the question we've got here: how do we change our approaches, tailor our tools to make sure we're mobilizing many different segments with our efforts around sponsorship? We have a second question that is really about how to sustain surges of interest, pointing specifically to Afghanistan, this moment where we have a heightened interest. 2015, another example we've heard about today, another moment of heightened interest. Do those of you working on this have suggestions and advice for us in terms of how to both sustain and also leverage these moments to achieve our goals around public attitudes? What should we be doing in these moments of interest around refugees to do to maximize our leverage? And the third question there, one really, I think that's about hope, given Brexit, given Trump, given the potential second term of Trump in the United States. and the small size of sponsorship programs that have been introduced recently. How hopeful are each of you around the potential of these programs to really shift some of the polarization and politicization in this space? So there's 3 questions to start. Those are big questions. I'll invite small responses if I may, and I know we've got a few other questions teeing up here as well. Tim, maybe I'll start by turning back to you, and feel free to also comment on what you've heard from the discussants as well, since I think they also added some thoughts that you may want to reply to. Thanks again.
Thanks. Yeah, really appreciated the panelist contribution. On the question of is sponsorship enough to combat the rise of xenophobia? I mean, there's a lot of very strong forces that are a sort of a perfect storm of social media environment, economic factors, cultural factors, the pace of change, a lot of factors that are driving the power of us versus them narratives. No, sponsorship alone is not going to turn the tide. However, the principles of why sponsorship has the capacity to shift public attitudes are the principles through which we will defeat the forces of us versus them. Right, like what you're doing on sponsorship and on perceptions of refugees is fundamentally the same as what you do on any of the us versus them, about migration, migrants generally, also about Muslims, about any minorities, and even about the kind of the political divisions in the US, very strong, you know, between liberals and conservatives. So the principles actually work, and it's telling the larger story of us and breaking down those false us versus them divisions. I'll just take one other question on the how we get beyond the crisis moments and sustain interest. So I mean, that you're absolutely right. I would flip that slightly and say moments of when the public attention is focused on the problem of refugees, the refugee circumstances, refugee crises, however you want to call them, they are big opportunities to build infrastructure and to get policy changes, because that's the moment when decision makers are paying attention, when people are willing to give money. And so if you look at what's happened with Welcome.us, the initiative of building significant infrastructure around community sponsorship in the US now around the last few months, it's a great example. They've seized the moment and they've got lasting change, I think will be lasting change out of that moment. And then following that, yeah, you've got to do all of the hard work that Jennifer and the team have been tirelessly doing for the last 5 years, which is incredibly complex and, you know, very technical. And it's exactly as Louisa says, like, programs have to actually have people sort of signing up. There's so much work to, I mean, it's a great community project to actually get this going in one country. To see what GRSI has done across almost 20 countries, I find it just astonishing and so exciting. But yeah, that's the hard work that you're having to do day in, day out. But you seize those moments because they only come, you know, once every few years normally. And they are the moments when you can galvanize a lot of support that then allows us to build something that can, it accelerates the process of change so that you can then build from there.
Great, thanks so much. Ali, can I bring you in on this question of how the campaign that you help lead really reach so many different types of communities? We've got a question here that includes, how did you get to rural centers as well as metropolitan centers? How did you get people with lived experiences and also all those towns and municipalities? Could you offer a little reflection on that? And then Louisa, looking forward to bringing you in on this and more.
Yeah, definitely. So some of the techniques that were used, I guess, it's a matter of what the way I guess my colleagues and myself did it through the My New Neighbour campaign was mostly through multicultural organizations, where, you know, multicultural organizations, I guess, are all somewhat connected to refugees or settlement services, for example, settlement organizations which are involved with, you know, settling refugees have been a lot of the resources that we tap into, as well as, I guess, for more of the advisors that sit on the table, a lot of them were tapped through, you know, leadership programs, big conferences that, you know, which kind of really showcase the power of refugees, such as our FECA conference here in Australia, which involves, many refugee leaders, advocates, ambassadors coming together in a huge event. And then when it comes to reaching out to communities directly, it's knowing what works for those communities. Not all communities work through email or, receive information through emails. So it was even a matter of going to their direct resources, such as using apps such as WhatsApp or Facebook or Viber, seeing what works for these communities and reaching out to them with their own resources.
Thank you so much. And Louisa, I think that's a perfect segue into some of your comments. I know Refugee 613 has been doing also some really interesting work thinking about what channels you're using to reach different kind of audiences. So maybe I'll turn it over to you. A number of topics live on the table for you to choose from for your reflections. Thanks.
Sure. Well, starting with that last one, it actually ties into something I wanted to address, that one of the questions had sort of been about, what kind of tools and how do we mobilize on a grand scale. The challenge is that, as Ali has talked about with newcomers, like, you've got to work with what communications channels work for that audience. And the same is with sponsors. So we're actually spending a lot of time figuring out who we want to target with sponsorship recruitment information. And therefore, we're doing some market research on that. We're kind of slicing data to sort of look at different demographic profiles, but more importantly, values and behavior, their volunteerism behavior, for example. We're looking at geography. And then once we've kind of identified some potential places to target our efforts, we're going to be literally writing the messages and developing the tools to suit that audience. Is it an audience who's going to want to hear from you by video first, or are they going to want to read something in their community newsletter first, and trying to figure out what's going to work for them? So that's where I talk about, it's long and slow, but the payoff is huge. The other thing I wanted to actually talk about was, the idea of capturing surge moments. And this is a big issue for us. Obviously, Jen, from all the work on the Syrian surge, and now with Afghans as well. And it's true, there's a lot of interest out there. But what we also want to do is make sure we maintain a sort of an equity lens on this, because for instance, in Canada, we have a current backload of over 70,000 individuals who are waiting to be sponsored from all over the world, including Afghans who've been out of Afghanistan and in refugee camps for, upwards of 20 years. So the idea is to kind of work on policy mechanisms that allow you to meet the surge moment without sacrificing that equity lens, and making sure that you're still addressing the long-term resettlement needs that weigh on us all so heavily. So that's a real concern. But I do agree with Tim. I think that Canada's refugee sponsorship program began in a surge moment in the late 70s, early 80s with the Indo-Chinese resettlement, and kind of was expanded and refined over successive waves. And then the biggest was the Syrians in 2015, 2016. And so we've learned from all that, and people who sponsored at that time have gone on to become part of the movement and become ambassadors for it. And now we're seeing the same thing. I think also Tim flagged the currently with the Afghans, the veterans and the currently serving military. That's not an audience that we would be looking at intensively if it weren't for the Afghan situation. So we're trying to figure out how to engage them. They're already engaged in their own ways. They didn't wait for anybody. They've mobilized. They're working on things, but how we convince them that sponsorship is a vehicle for their interest as well is really important. But again, as Ali said, and I think everyone agrees, making sure that we keep power dynamics in mind, that we keep that equity in mind in terms of design, and that we are addressing something that is a common good and not a moment of saviorism.
Great, thank you so much. I'm mindful of time, and sadly, well, I'm sure we could continue this conversation for many more minutes. I think that we are starting to close to the end of our session together. I want to thank everybody who have posted some questions, and I think we'll have an opportunity, hopefully, to continue engaging on this topic with many of you in different ways, in small group sessions and bilateral sessions going forward. So thank you very much. We've noted the questions that we didn't get to today. Thank you so much for those who have posted them, and for all of you for being with us. Tim, I thought I might turn to you just for the last word, if I could. You've heard a lot from other experts on the panel. There's been a lot of interesting questions being posted. Any final reflections for us before we close out the session today?
Look, only to say that I think and I kind of alluded to it just a moment ago, the moment that we're in with the establishment of community sponsorship in different countries across the world is a very unusual moment. And if you wind the clock back to what I was mentioning right at the start, we were in a very difficult position in the mid 2010s, the kind of the backlash that was happening across the world, the rise of the populists like Trump and the Brexit vote and the AfD and Le Pen in France and so forth. To think that if you were to wind back then and say, you're still going to be facing a very difficult 5 years, you're going to have pandemic, this and that, but in 5 years' time, you're going to have, almost 20 other countries who will have piloted or established new programs to welcome refugees. You would not have believed that was possible. I mean, even in your wildest, most optimistic dreams, you wouldn't have believed that's possible. And it's happened. Now, in a sense, those of us who are engaged, we kind of move on to the next challenge. And the next challenge is make these programs work, seize their potential and to shift public attitudes. And, you tear your hair out of various different sort of pieces along the way where, bureaucrats get in the way or something goes wrong, like all of that. But let's just, if you stand back from it, what has been done in the last 5 years, and it's just a huge credit to Jennifer and Nathan and the whole team and the very large networks across all of those countries, and many people today listening to this are part of that. But what has been achieved is really remarkable, and it's against the odds. And last thing to say is it's very, very important, because I think that I also do a lot of work on climate change. The point where climate change and migration anxieties are going to intersect, like where it's going to be crunch point, whether we're talking 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever. The crunch point is climate is going to cause large-scale people movements. The reality is we can manage that as a world if we work together. We have to have models and understanding of communication and so forth in place well before those crunch points, those crisis points. So one thing that we're doing right now with this work is preparing for some very significant challenges that are coming up in the future. And so that's why I think, fast forward 5, 10, whatever years from now, you're going to look back and say, this was some of the most significant work done anywhere in the world to deal with some of the most, the pointy end of some of the biggest problems the world's facing. So that's why I think, although, it can feel quite small, I actually think that the work that is being done here is very important, not just specifically on the issue of refugee policy, but actually, also for climate and some of these bigger drivers of division. So, I mean, a big thank you to everybody who's putting their shoulder to the wheel on this, because it's such important work. And I just, big credit to Ali and to Graham, the achievements in Australia. Louise is such a fantastic guide in this and has such depth of experience. And yeah, very appreciate the opportunity to contribute today.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Tim, for being here and being part of those who are leaning in on this. I do think this is really a collective global effort, and it's a privilege to learn from and walk alongside so many committed colleagues all over the world, many of whom are with us today, either watching or watching after the effect when we send them this video. So thank you for sharing your expertise. Thank you so much to Louisa and Ali also for being here. I think Nathan's going to close us out with some remarks, but I will just say from a personal perspective, it's been a joy to learn with you here today, but also to learn alongside all of the great leadership that you offer to the field every day, and really looking forward to continuing all of that together. Thanks, Tim, for inspiring us and reminding us why it all matters. Nathan, over to you to close us out.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. It's been a fantastic discussion. It's clearly a multifaceted topic and one on which much more could be said, but I think we've surfaced some really interesting insights and discussion here today, and a lot of food for thought. I want to thank Tim, Louisa, Ali, and Graham for sharing your expertise with us today, and Jennifer for your expert moderation. Thanks again to the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue for supporting this series. You can follow us at Refugee Hub on Twitter for updates on this series. We're going to be concluding the series with our capstone event in February, so you'll be hearing more about that shortly. Thanks so much for joining us, and that concludes our workshop today.